Get off the table and eat on the floor. My 15-year-old brother Tyler screamed the words as his hand slammed into my shoulders, shoving me so hard my dining chair tipped backward. I hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud, sickening thud. Laughter immediately erupted around the extravagant dining room. My sister Brittany and her husband Jamal were practically in tears, holding their stomachs, as if this was the funniest comedy routine they had ever witnessed. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply looked up at them from the ground, brushed the dust off my skirt, and smiled a very cold smile. "Enjoy this dinner," I said quietly as I stood up. "It is your last free one." That night, sitting in the quiet isolation of my car, I opened an app on my phone and canceled the $7,800 monthly payment that had been keeping a luxury roof over their heads for the last 5 years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who constantly underestimated your worth and mistreated your kindness. Growing up, I was always the odd one out in my family. My name is Dani. I am 33 years old, and I work as a data scientist analyzing financial risks for a major insurance firm. I deal with logic numbers and undeniable facts. My family, on the other hand, deals entirely in delusions and appearances. My parents, Richard and Susan, raised us in a world where looking wealthy was far more important than actually being wealthy. They poured all their attention and resources into my older sister Brittany and my much younger brother Tyler, leaving me to fend for myself. I was the reliable one, the boring one, the one who paid her own way through college while they financed Brittany's lavish lifestyle and Tyler's endless demands. The incident that finally broke the camel's back happened on a chilly Friday evening. My parents had insisted on hosting a grand family dinner at their massive 5-bedroom estate to celebrate Jamal securing what he claimed was a massive cryptocurrency investment. Jamal is a charismatic guy, always dressed in designer labels, always talking a big game about his financial moves. My parents absolutely adored him because he fit their aesthetic of success, completely ignoring the fact that he and Brittany were constantly asking for loans that they never repaid. I had arrived at the house straight from the office, exhausted from a 10-hour workday. I walked into the dining room, which was heavily scented with expensive candles and filled with the chatter of my family drinking premium wine. I took a seat near the head of the long mahogany table simply because it was the closest empty chair. I had barely set my water glass down when Tyler stormed into the room. He was wearing an $800 pair of sneakers that my mother had undoubtedly put on a high-interest credit card. He marched right up to me and glared. "You are in my seat," he demanded, crossing his arms. I looked around the table. There were at least 6 other empty chairs. I told him to just sit anywhere else, as I was already settled and deeply tired. Tyler's face turned red. He has always been the golden child, the miracle baby born late in my parents' lives, and he had never been told the word no. "Move, Dani," he snapped. "This is my house and I sit where I want." Before I could even process his sheer audacity, he grabbed the back of my heavy wooden chair and violently yanked it backward. I lost my balance completely. The chair crashed to the floor, taking me down with it. My shoulder slammed into the ground, pain shooting down my arm. I gasped, entirely shocked by the physical aggression. But what shocked me more was the reaction of the people who were supposed to love me. Jamal let out a booming laugh, slapping the table. Brittany giggled into her wineglass, shaking her head. I looked over at my parents, expecting them to reprimand their out-of-control teenager. Instead, my mother Susan simply sighed, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, Dani, please stop being so dramatic," she said, not even making eye contact with me. "Just get up and find another seat so we can eat in peace. You know how Tyler gets when he is hungry." My father Richard did not even look up from his phone, completely validating the violence by ignoring it. I stayed on the floor for a few seconds, letting the reality of my existence in this family wash over me. For 5 years, I had compromised my own happiness to maintain their perfect image. I had swallowed their insults, endured their blatant favoritism, and accepted being treated like a second-class citizen in my own life. But lying there on the floor, while my family laughed at my humiliation, something inside me finally snapped. The lingering guilt and obligation evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, icy clarity. I stood up slowly. I did not scream, and I did not demand an apology. I looked at Tyler's smug face, then at Jamal's mocking grin, and finally at my parents' utter indifference. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. "Enjoy this dinner," I said, my voice steady and low. "It is your last free one." I turned around, picked up my coat, and walked out the front door without looking back. The night air was freezing as I slid into the driver's seat of my car, but I felt a strange radiating heat in my chest. It was the warmth of absolute liberation. I did not turn the key in the ignition right away. Instead, I pulled my laptop from my work bag, connected it to my phone's hotspot, and logged into the resident portal for the property management company that owned the estate my parents were currently eating in. What my entitled brother, my arrogant brother-in-law, and my oblivious sister did not know was the massive, suffocating secret my parents had forced me to keep for half a decade. 5 years ago, Richard's desperate attempts to maintain a millionaire lifestyle on a middle-class income had finally caught up with him. He had secretly filed for bankruptcy. The bank had seized their previous home, and they were days away from being literally out on the street. My father had come to my small apartment crying and begging for me to save them. Because my credit was impeccable and my income was substantial, I agreed to be the sole leaseholder and guarantor for a luxury rental property so they could keep up appearances. For 5 years, while they treated me like garbage, I had been paying $7,800 every single month to keep a roof over their heads. I paid the rent, I paid the utilities, and I paid for the privilege of being their emotional punching bag. They had spent so long living in the illusion of their own wealth that they had genuinely convinced themselves it was their house. They had forgotten who actually held the keys to their kingdom. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. The dashboard showed my pristine payment history, thousands and thousands of dollars drained from my accounts to support people who would not even offer me a chair at a dining table. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I navigated to the billing section. With one click, I deleted my banking information and turned off the autopay feature. Then I opened a blank email, addressed it to my dedicated property manager, and typed out a formal, legally binding notice of lease termination. I requested that the termination be effective immediately due to a complete withdrawal of financial support, initiating the standard eviction protocol. I hit send. The screen flashed, confirming the message was delivered. I leaned back against the leather headrest of my car and let out a long, shuddering breath. The ticking clock had officially started. Tomorrow morning, the property management company would process the termination. By Monday, the legal notices would be drafted. And very soon, the family that had laughed at me on the floor would find themselves standing on the street with absolutely nothing. I put my car in drive, pulled out of the massive driveway, and headed back to my own quiet, peaceful apartment, ready to watch their house of cards completely collapse. The morning sun filtered through the massive windows of my downtown apartment, casting a warm, peaceful glow across my living room. For the first time in 5 years, I woke up feeling completely weightless. There was no familiar knot of anxiety resting in my stomach. There was no impending dread about what financial crisis my family would invent for me to solve today. I walked into my modern kitchen, brewed a cup of premium dark roast coffee, and inhaled the comforting scent. I sat down on my velvet sofa and finally picked up my mobile phone from the marble counter. When I tapped the screen, it immediately lit up with a relentless barrage of notifications that would normally have sent my heart racing into a total panic. I stared at the bright display, letting the reality of the situation sink in completely. There were exactly 73 missed calls. Let me repeat that number so you truly understand the sheer magnitude of their desperation. 73 missed calls, all frantically logged between 7 and 9 in the morning. They were predominantly from my mother Susan, with a few scattered aggressive calls from my father Richard and my older sister Brittany. My teenage brother Tyler, of course, had not called me a single time, primarily because that would require him to expend actual effort. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, feeling the comforting heat spread evenly through my chest. I did not feel an ounce of fear or obligation. Instead, I felt a deep, profound, and highly satisfying sense of dark amusement. I tapped the glowing voicemail icon on my screen and saw a rambling 3-minute audio message left by my mother just 10 minutes prior. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker mode. Her frantic, shrill voice completely filled the quiet sanctuary of my apartment. "Dani, pick up your phone right now," Susan commanded loudly, completely bypassing any standard polite greeting. I am currently standing in the middle of an exclusive designer boutique downtown with Tyler, and we are experiencing the most humiliating moment of our entire lives. Your father gave Tyler his platinum credit card so he could buy those limited edition $800 sneakers he has been relentlessly begging for all month. The specific shoes he desperately needs to wear to Jamal's very lavish birthday party tonight to impress everyone. And the teenage cashier behind the counter just loudly told us the card was declined. Declined, Dani. Do you have any idea how deeply embarrassing it is to have a luxury credit card declined in front of a store manager and a line of wealthy customers? We look like absolute peasants right now. Susan paused to take a dramatic, heavy, frustrated breath. The chaotic sounds of a busy shopping mall echoed clearly in the background. I sat there and expected her to perhaps mention the terrifying fact that her teenage son had violently shoved me to the dining room floor. That terrible physical assault happened less than 12 hours ago. I expected maybe a tiny sliver of fake manufactured remorse, or even a flimsy half-baked excuse for his highly aggressive behavior. But absolutely not. In Susan's incredibly warped mind, the physical assault of her eldest daughter was completely irrelevant and forgotten. The true monumental tragedy of the century was her precious golden child being denied a pair of ridiculously overpriced basketball shoes. The absurd voicemail continued playing, her tone rapidly shifting from a state of pure social panic to a direct and highly aggressive accusation aimed straight at me. "I know you manage the emergency transfer accounts for your father, Dani. You must have stupidly forgotten to move the funds over this week like you usually do. You know perfectly well that Richard is incredibly busy managing high-level investment portfolios and simply cannot be bothered with these minor, tedious banking details. I need you to log into the financial portal, immediately fix whatever careless glitch you caused, and transfer $2,000 to the main spending account just to be perfectly safe." Tyler is incredibly stressed out and on the verge of crying right now about this delay. The absolute last thing we need is for his entire weekend to be completely ruined just because you were careless with the administrative work. Call me the absolute second it is done. Do not make us wait another minute. The line clicked sharply and went completely dead. I leaned back into my sofa cushions and actually laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated delusion of that woman was truly something to behold. She genuinely believed that she could allow her entitled son to physically abuse me, laugh directly in my face with the rest of them, and then arrogantly demand help. What Susan conveniently ignored was the true pathetic nature of that joint account. My father Richard was secretly bankrupt, pretending to day trade while losing his dignity. 5 years ago, when I signed the lease on their massive rental house to save them from homelessness, they aggressively manipulated me into setting up a joint emergency bank account. Over the passing years, that vital emergency account slowly morphed into their personal slush fund. I was the sole person depositing $2,000 every single month out of my own corporate paycheck, systematically funding their absolutely extravagant and completely fake luxury lifestyle. But last night, right after I officially canceled the lease on their house, I logged into my secure banking application and completely severed my personal connection to that joint account. I withdrew the entire remaining balance and closed the automatic transfer portal permanently. Without my quiet monthly influx of cash, Richard's credit cards were finally hitting their true devastating limits, exposing their bankrupt reality. I picked up my phone and opened the active message thread with my mother. I watched the typing indicator bubbling up as she frantically drafted another demanding paragraph. I did not want to call her back. They had permanently lost that precious privilege. Instead, I carefully typed out a single definitive sentence, making absolutely sure my grammar was perfect and my tone was entirely devoid of any residual emotion. I typed, "Not my card, not my problem," and I hit send. The delivery receipt popped up instantly on the bright screen, followed quickly by the red receipt. I calmly watched the digital display, silently counting the passing seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Suddenly, my phone began vibrating so violently it nearly slid right off the edge of the smooth, modern marble coffee table today. Susan was aggressively calling. I casually watched her name flash, letting the loud ringtone echo until it finally went straight to voicemail. The exact moment the call ended, another one immediately began. It was Richard calling this time, followed closely by Brittany. Then the angry text messages suddenly started pouring in like a massive digital avalanche. Susan angrily texted, "What is that cryptic message supposed to mean? Call me right now. This is not funny, Dani." Richard texted, "Stop throwing a childish tantrum and fix the bank account immediately." The panic had officially set in. They were completely unraveling today. The relentless flood of angry text messages from my parents eventually began to slow down as their panic gave way to complete exhaustion. But my quiet Saturday morning was not entirely mine just yet. My phone buzzed one final time, sliding slightly across the smooth marble coffee table. I glanced down and saw a direct message notification from my brother-in-law, Jamal. It was not a text message. It was a lengthy audio file clocking in at exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds. I stared at his name on the bright screen. Jamal always positioned himself as the ultimate, modern financial success story. He frequently boasted about being a self-made cryptocurrency investor who had supposedly conquered the digital financial markets through sheer brilliance and raw intuition. He wore designer suits, drove a leased luxury sports car, and constantly demanded absolute respect from everyone in our immediate family orbit. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on because he projected the exact image of extreme wealth they so desperately craved. I tapped the play button and let his deep, smooth voice echo through my quiet living room. "Dani, Dani, Dani." Jamal began, his voice dripping with heavy condescension and fake sympathy. "I just got off the phone with your mother, and honestly, I am incredibly disappointed in your behavior today. What exactly is going through your head right now? You are a 33-year-old woman throwing a petty temper tantrum over a simple banking error while your family is out trying to enjoy a nice weekend. You really need to gain some perspective on life." He paused, taking a loud, arrogant sip of what sounded like a hot beverage. "You know, Dani, this is exactly why you are always so miserable and stressed out. You are completely trapped in that rigid corporate rat race. You sit in a boring cubicle all day playing with data and crunching numbers for an insurance company just to collect a tiny, predictable paycheck every 2 weeks. You have a poor person mentality. You let a few $1,000s stress you out because you do not understand how real money actually flows." Jamal chuckled softly into the microphone, a sound that genuinely made my skin crawl. "Let me teach you a quick lesson about real wealth," he continued, his tone shifting into full arrogant lecture mode. "While you were busy crying over a declined credit card this morning, I was sitting on my balcony sipping an imported espresso and trading altcoins. I casually closed a single position and cleared $50,000 in pure liquid profit before 9 in the morning. 50 grand, Dani. That is probably what you make in an entire 6 months of slaving away at your little desk job. When you operate at my level, you do not sweat the small stuff. You take care of your people. You elevate your family. You do not leave your teenage brother stranded at a shoe store looking like a total fool. Richard and Susan have done absolutely everything for you, and you are treating them like massive burdens. It is completely unacceptable, and frankly, it makes you look incredibly pathetic." He paused again, letting his harsh words sink in before delivering his ultimate ridiculous demand. So here is what you are going to do to fix this mess and make peace with the family. Tonight is my birthday party, and there will be very important investors attending. I will not allow your toxic negative energy to ruin my celebration. You are going to log into your little bank account and fix whatever block you put on his card immediately. Then you are going to go straight to the luxury watch boutique downtown. You are going to purchase that entry-level Rolex Oyster Perpetual that Tyler has been asking for. Consider it a formal apology gift for humiliating him in front of the entire family last night and for ruining his morning today. Bring the watch to the party tonight, hand it to him publicly, and apologize to your parents. If you can manage to do that with a smile on your face, I will personally talk to Richard and Susan and convince them to forgive you. Do not mess this up, Dani. Be an adult and fix your ridiculous mistakes. The audio message abruptly ended, leaving my apartment in total silence once again. I sat perfectly still on my velvet sofa, letting his arrogant words bounce around inside my head. Jamal thought he was an absolute genius, manipulating me with a mixture of heavy shame and aggressive financial boasting. But he had made one very critical error. He forgot who he was talking to. I am a professional data scientist. My entire career is built on identifying patterns, analyzing complex risk, and sniffing out statistical anomalies that do not make logical sense. And the financial picture Jamal just painted for me did not make any mathematical sense whatsoever. My analytical mind immediately kicked into high gear, slicing through his arrogant lies. If Jamal was truly clearing $50,000 in pure profit on a random Saturday morning, why did Brittany secretly ask me to cover her car payment 3 months ago? If Jamal was a multi-millionaire cryptocurrency genius, why were they living in a moderately priced townhouse instead of a massive custom-built estate? Why did he never pay for family dinners despite constantly bragging about his massive portfolio? And most importantly, why did my parents rely on my monthly $2,000 emergency fund deposits instead of simply asking their wildly successful son-in-law for a minor loan? The math simply did not add up. The numbers were fundamentally broken. Jamal was projecting the image of a tycoon while demanding that I buy a $10,000 watch to appease a teenager. A sudden sharp realization hit me like a physical bolt of electricity. Jamal was a total fraud, actively bleeding my bankrupt parents completely dry today. I sat in the quiet of my living room as the deep, heavy silence completely washed over me today. Jamal had originally intended for his arrogant audio message to make me feel incredibly small. He wanted to crush my spirit and force me into absolute submission. But he vastly underestimated the type of person he was dealing with. I am not a helpless victim who cries over mean words. I am a professional data scientist. I spend 40 hours a week looking at massive sets of information to identify fraud, mitigate risk, and expose hidden truths. When my emotions fade, my analytical mind takes complete control. And right now my brain was firing on all cylinders. I calmly stood up from my comfortable velvet sofa, took a very deep breath, and walked directly down the hall to my private home office. I bypassed my personal computer and opened my high-powered work laptop. It was time to stop feeling sorry for myself and start doing what I do best. I sat down at my sleek desk and cracked my knuckles. The screen glowed brightly, illuminating the dark room. 5 years ago, when my father Richard cried in my small apartment begging for salvation, he manipulated me into opening a joint emergency bank account. The stated purpose of this account was for survival necessities: groceries, medical bills, and basic living expenses. Every single month, on the first day of the month, I faithfully transferred $2,000 of my own hard-earned salary into that specific account. Over 5 years, that amounted to $120,000 of my money. I had always assumed my parents were using it to keep themselves afloat, while Richard supposedly rebuilt his career. I had purposefully avoided looking too closely at the transaction history because I wanted to respect their privacy. That blind trust officially ended today. I logged into the secure banking portal and navigated to the joint account dashboard. The interface loaded, displaying a pitiful remaining balance of just $42. I clicked on the export button and downloaded the entire 5-year transaction history as a raw data file. I imported the massive spreadsheet into my specialized statistical software. For an average person, staring at thousands of rows of banking data is overwhelming and confusing. But to me, it is like reading a perfectly clear story. Data never lies. Data does not manipulate you or yell at you or push you onto a dining room floor. Data simply tells the absolute truth. I began sorting the columns, categorizing the expenditures, to see exactly where my money had been going. I fully expected to see a long, boring list of mundane everyday transactions for local supermarkets, community pharmacies, and perhaps the occasional modest dinner at a cheap restaurant. Instead, what I immediately noticed was a glaring statistical anomaly. The grocery store transactions were surprisingly small and infrequent. The medical expenses were practically non-existent. But there was a massive repeating category of outbound money that completely dominated the spreadsheet. Every single month, within 3 days of my $2,000 deposit arriving, a large chunk of that exact money was immediately siphoned right back out. We are talking about withdrawals of $1,500 or sometimes the entire balance, all leaving the account in a single transaction. I leaned closer to my monitor, my eyes narrowing as I scrutinized the destination codes. These were not standard bill payments. These were direct electronic wire transfers moving large sums of money rapidly. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I isolated every single wire transfer over the past 5 years. There were dozens of them. I traced the routing numbers and the destination details. Every single one of these massive transfers was being sent to a third-party financial institution that specializes in digital asset exchanges. In simple terms, my parents were sending my money to cryptocurrency trading platforms. But Richard and Susan barely knew how to use their smartphones, let alone navigate the complex world of decentralized digital currency. They were absolutely not trading digital assets themselves. I dug deeper, running a reverse search on the specific destination wallet identifiers noted in the banking transfer memos. It took me less than 15 short minutes to quickly uncover the final piece of the puzzle. The digital wallets receiving all of this cash were registered under a corporate entity name. A very specific, pretentious corporate entity name that I recognized instantly. It was the exact same fake holding company that Jamal proudly listed on his social media profiles. The realization hit me so hard I actually gasped in the quiet room. Jamal was not a self-made millionaire. He was not a financial genius. He was a complete and utter fraud whose entire luxurious lifestyle was being secretly subsidized by my paycheck. My parents had been systematically draining my emergency deposits and funneling that cash directly into these failing investments to keep up his ridiculous wealthy facade. The absolute irony of the situation was unbelievable. Jamal had just spent 3 minutes lecturing me about my poor person mentality and bragging about his massive profits. He demanded I buy Tyler a $10,000 watch because I supposedly did not understand how real wealth worked. Meanwhile, the only reason he could even afford his leased sports car and his designer coffee was because he was secretly bleeding his bankrupt father-in-law dry. And Richard was willingly handing over my money just to keep his golden son-in-law happy. They had stolen from me to fund a fantasy. I sat back in my ergonomic office chair, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spreading across my face. They thought I was just a weak, lonely woman they could bully and discard. They had absolutely no idea that they had just blindly handed a highly skilled master data analyst the exact ultimate digital weapon perfectly needed to completely and permanently destroy their false lives forever. I sat back in my chair staring at the glaring evidence of their financial betrayal. The glowing screen illuminated my face in the dim office. Finding the cryptocurrency fraud was only one piece of a much larger and darker puzzle. To truly understand the depths of their delusion, I needed to revisit the very beginning of this nightmare. I took a long, slow sip of cold water to steady my racing heart before proceeding any further. I opened a secure archived folder on my computer hard drive. It was a digital vault I had intentionally avoided opening for 5 long years. The folder was simply labeled Legal. Inside was the complete documented history of my father Richard and his monumental failure as a provider. I clicked on the first document in the timeline and was immediately transported back to a rainy Tuesday evening half a decade ago. It is truly fascinating how quickly people can conveniently forget their own pathetic desperation when their immediate survival is no longer at risk. I opened a PDF file containing the official court documents for a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. 5 years ago, Richard had recklessly gambled his entire corporate severance package on a series of terrible investments, trying to project the image of a wealthy tycoon. He failed miserably. His business partners had abandoned him entirely, leaving him to face the disastrous legal consequences completely alone. The bank foreclosed on their previous home, and his credit score completely tanked. He was drowning in massive debt and facing absolute financial ruin. I scrolled down to the next file, which was an incredibly long and pathetic email from Richard himself. I read his desperate words out loud in the quiet room. "Dani, please, you have to help us. We have absolutely nowhere to go. We are going to be living out on the street. Please use your excellent credit and your generous salary to sign a lease for us. I promise this is only temporary. I will pay you back every single penny once I get back on my feet. Just do not let our friends find out about this terrible situation. We simply cannot survive the crushing public humiliation." That single email was the ultimate, undeniable proof of his complete surrender. At 28 years old, I had just secured my first major promotion as a data scientist. I was saving my money to buy my own house. But I was foolishly blinded by a heavy sense of familial duty. I wrongly believed that offering them a generous lifeline would finally earn me the unconditional parental love I had always craved. I felt an overwhelming sense of pity for the man who was supposed to guide and protect me. I clicked on the third document in the digital folder. It was a scanned copy of a residential lease agreement for the massive luxury 5-bedroom estate they currently occupied. My name, Dani, was printed clearly as the sole responsible tenant and financial guarantor. My signature was written in blue ink at the bottom of the page, legally binding me to a massive monthly payment of $7,800. I had effectively sacrificed my own secure financial future to provide my family with a luxurious sanctuary they absolutely did not deserve. But the most fascinating and deeply disturbing part of this entire situation was the rapid psychological shift that occurred immediately after they moved their belongings into that house. The deep, endless gratitude Richard promised in his desperate email completely evaporated within a few short months. Once they were safely surrounded by expensive hardwood floors and vaulted ceilings, they began to actively rewrite their own history. They threw lavish dinner parties for their oblivious friends and boldly claimed they had simply decided to downsize into a more manageable rental property for mere convenience. Richard went right back to wearing tailored designer suits and acting like the untouchable patriarch of a wealthy dynasty. My mother Susan went right back to loudly bragging about her elite country club memberships. And suddenly I was no longer the brave savior who rescued them from impending homelessness. I slowly became a convenient background character in their grandiose fictional reality. The emotional gaslighting was so extreme and so incredibly consistent that they genuinely brainwashed themselves into believing their own lies. Whenever I came over for weekly family dinners, they treated me like an ungrateful house guest who should feel immensely lucky just to be invited into their beautiful home. They openly complained if I parked my modest, reliable car in their pristine driveway because it apparently ruined the wealthy aesthetic of the neighborhood. They constantly criticized my perfectly respectable career, claiming I lacked the natural ambition to truly succeed, like my arrogant brother-in-law Jamal. They completely erased the undeniable fact that every single brick in that beautiful house was paid for by the very corporate salary they constantly mocked. I was literally funding their entire existence while they treated me like a burdensome peasant who failed to measure up to their impossible standards. I calmly closed the old archived legal documents and minimized the glowing digital folders. The stark, horrifying contrast between Richard crying and begging me for a safe place to live 5 years ago, and Richard actively allowing his entitled teenage son to aggressively push me onto the hardwood floor last night, was absolutely sickening. They had deliberately exploited my fierce loyalty, deliberately drained my hard-earned savings, and deliberately funded a massive con artist, all while demanding absolute total obedience from me. I took a deep breath and prepared for the battle. A sudden sharp vibration on my smooth wooden desk completely shattered the heavy silence in my home office. It was my mobile phone loudly ringing once again. I slowly looked down at the bright screen. It was an incoming voice call from Richard. He was undoubtedly calling to officially summon me to their house and punish me for the declined credit card incident today. The vibration of my mobile phone shattered the silence of my home office today. I stared at the screen displaying my father Richard and his call. I let it ring 3 times before pressing the answer button. I did not say hello. I simply waited for him to speak first. Dani, you need to come to Brittany and Jamal and their townhouse immediately. Richard commanded, his voice dripping with annoyance. We are having a mandatory family meeting to discuss your unacceptable behavior today. Do not test my patience, just get over here right now. The line went dead before I could take a breath to respond. He genuinely thought he was still the untouchable patriarch issuing orders from his throne. I closed my laptop and grabbed my car keys. I was not going to their meeting to apologize or beg for forgiveness. I was going because I wanted to look them in the eyes while holding the truth of their financial fraud securely in my mind. As I pulled into the visitor parking lot, I took a moment to observe Brittany and Jamal in their residence. For a man who claimed to be clearing $50,000 in pure profit on a Saturday morning, his living situation was remarkably average. They lived in a standard 3-bedroom townhouse with peeling paint and a patch of dead grass near the front door. It was a massive visual contradiction to the opulent estate I was currently funding for my parents. I walked up the concrete path and knocked firmly on the wooden door. Brittany yanked the door open almost immediately, her face set in a dramatic scowl. She turned her back and walked toward the living room, expecting me to follow her like a disobedient child called to the principal in his office. I stepped inside and took off my coat. The atmosphere in the room was thick and entirely hostile. They had arranged themselves like a Supreme Court tribunal, ready to pass down a harsh sentence. Richard was sitting directly in the center of the sofa, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, trying to look as intimidating as possible. Susan sat beside him, clutching a small designer handbag like a protective shield. Jamal was leaning against the kitchen counter, holding a glass of expensive whiskey, looking incredibly smug and confident. Tyler was sprawled out comfortably in a matching armchair, playing a video game on his mobile phone, completely ignoring my arrival. There was exactly one empty dining chair placed directly in the center of the room, facing the large sofa, an obvious psychological tactic designed to make me feel incredibly small, isolated, and completely defensive. I walked over and sat down in the wooden chair, crossing my legs elegantly and folding my hands in my lap. I am here, I said quietly, looking directly into Richard and his angry eyes. Start the meeting. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees. Your mother and I are deeply disgusted by your childish actions this morning, he began, his tone echoing loudly in the cramped room. You intentionally embarrassed your teenage brother in a public retail store because you were throwing a petty tantrum over a seating arrangement last night. It is far past time for you to grow up and stop acting like a jealous, bitter teenager. I sat perfectly still, letting his hypocritical words wash over me. Before I could even formulate a rational response, Susan jumped eagerly into the one-sided conversation. Your father is absolutely right, she snapped, her dark eyes narrowing sharply at me. You have completely lost touch with our family values. And frankly, We all know exactly why you are acting so hostile toward everyone in this room. You are deeply angry and bitter because you are still entirely single, while your sister is happily married to a highly successful man. Susan continued her harsh, relentless lecture, her voice rising higher in pitch. You have no loving husband to support you financially. You have no children. You live a completely selfish, isolated life in your downtown apartment. Because you have no real responsibilities of your own, it is your fundamental duty to support this family whenever we need administrative help. You are supposed to be a team player, Dani. Instead, you are actively disrespecting the clear family hierarchy that keeps us all functioning properly. You are tearing us apart with your intense selfishness. Jamal took a slow, arrogant sip of his expensive whiskey and loudly cleared his throat deliberately, drawing the entire room and their immediate attention. He pushed off the kitchen counter and walked over to stand directly behind Richard and Susan, placing his hands firmly on the back of their sofa. He was visually asserting himself as their ultimate protector and the true, successful son of the family. You need to understand your proper place in this dynamic, Dani Jamal said, his deep voice practically dripping with sickening condescension. Richard is the head of this entire family. I am the primary financial provider generating massive wealth through modern digital investments. Brittany and Susan are managing the essential household priorities and keeping everything running smoothly. Tyler is our bright future with endless potential. You are just a single corporate worker who processes basic data every single day. You should be endlessly grateful that we blindly allow you to manage the minor emergency accounts for us. We give you a valid sense of purpose and you repay our immense generosity with terrible, unforgivable disrespect. It stops today. I looked directly into Jamal and his incredibly arrogant dark eyes, silently thinking about the massive fraudulent wire transfers currently sitting securely in a digital folder on my desk at home. They were loudly lecturing me today about our grand family hierarchy and my supposed lack of success, while I silently smiled inside, knowing that their entire fake empire was built entirely on my stolen money and was exactly 3 days away from total, absolute destruction. I sat perfectly still on the hard wooden chair, letting Jamal and his arrogant words completely dissolve into the tense air of the cramped living room today. He stood proudly behind my parents, looking down at me with absolute contempt, completely unaware that I held the digital key to his total financial ruin. Richard cleared his throat loudly, signaling that the introductory lectures were officially over and the real purpose of this mandatory family meeting was about to begin. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on his knees. Listen to me very carefully, Dani, he said, his voice dropping into a severe, authoritative tone. You have caused a massive disruption in this family with your petty jealousy and your incredibly selfish financial stunts today. We have discussed this at length as a family unit, and we have decided that there must be significant consequences for your completely unacceptable behavior. You need to learn how to properly contribute to this household instead of just taking up space and causing unnecessary drama. Susan nodded enthusiastically beside him, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her lap. We are not asking for an apology anymore, Dani, she chimed in, her voice shrill and demanding. Apologies are just empty words. We demand real, tangible action to prove that you are actually committed to this family. I kept my face entirely blank, staring directly into my mother and her cold, calculating eyes. And what exactly does this tangible action look like? I asked, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. Richard sat up straight, adjusting his expensive tailored jacket. First of all, he began gesturing dismissively in the air. You are going to clear all of your personal belongings out of the guest bedroom at the main house this weekend. I felt a sudden sharp spike of pure disbelief, but I expertly masked it behind a calm expression. The guest bedroom he was referring to was actually my dedicated bedroom in the massive luxury estate that I personally leased and paid $7,800 a month to maintain. Tyler needs a dedicated space for his new virtual reality gaming setup. Richard continued casually, entirely oblivious to the massive irony of his demand. He is growing up, and he needs his own private recreational area to relax after his rigorous school days. Since you practically never visit us anymore and you live alone in your little downtown apartment, it makes absolutely zero sense for you to monopolize a large room in our house. You can just sleep on the downstairs sofa on the rare holidays you decide to grace us with your presence. Tyler finally looked up from his mobile phone, a smug, entitled grin spreading across his face. Yeah, Dani, he added carelessly. I am having my friends over next week, and I need that room completely empty. Do not leave any of your boring work clothes in the closet either. I want the entire space cleared out by Sunday night so I can set up my massive monitors and my new gaming chair. Brittany scoffed loudly from her position, leaning against the hallway wall. Honestly, you should have given up that room years ago, she muttered, shaking her head in profound disappointment. It is incredibly selfish for a grown single woman to hoard a large bedroom in a beautiful house she does not even live in full-time. You are always trying to mark your territory, and it is honestly pathetic. You really need to let Tyler have his space and stop trying to control everything. I slowly took a deep breath, letting their spectacular delusions wash over me. They were officially kicking me out of my own bedroom in a house that I fully funded every single month. It was a level of audacity so astronomical I almost wanted to laugh out loud right there in the living room. But Richard was not finished yet. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of crisp white paper. He slowly unfolded it and placed it deliberately on the small coffee table between us, smoothing out the creases with his hands. That brings us to our second requirement, Dani, he said, his tone turning incredibly formal and businesslike. He tapped his index finger firmly against the printed document. Since you clearly have an excess of disposable income sitting idly in your bank accounts, we have decided it is time for you to start investing properly in the future of this family. Tyler is attending a highly prestigious and incredibly expensive private high school, Richard declared proudly. As the head of this family, I carry a very heavy financial burden, ensuring he gets the absolute best education possible. Richard paused, looking at me, as if I should be weeping with deep gratitude for his completely fictional sacrifices. You, on the other hand, have absolutely no real financial burdens, Richard continued smoothly. You have no husband to care for. You have no children of your own to support. You just spend your massive corporate salary entirely on yourself. Therefore, we are officially requiring you to contribute $25,000 annually to cover Tyler and his private school tuition. He pushed the paper slightly closer to me. It is a formal commitment contract, and I expect you to sign it before you leave this house today. I stared down at the crisp white paper resting on the coffee table. Richard had actually taken the time to type out a formal legally binding agreement, demanding a massive portion of my annual income. Susan leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute entitlement. It is only fair, Dani, she insisted, her voice dripping with fake maternal logic. Your sister Brittany is busy raising her own family and supporting Jamal while he builds his massive investment portfolio. They have their own heavy financial obligations. You are the only person in this family with zero dependents and zero real responsibilities. It takes a village to raise a successful child, and it is your fundamental duty to step up and provide for your brother since you have no family of your own to worry about. Jamal nodded in strong agreement, taking another slow sip of his expensive whiskey. Exactly, he agreed loudly. When you have wealth, you distribute it to elevate your bloodline. You should be honored to pay for his elite education. Consider it an investment in the family legacy. $25,000 a year is absolute pocket change for someone with your incredibly low living expenses. Tyler smirked again, returning his focus entirely to his mobile game. Make sure you pay it before Friday, he demanded casually, without even looking up from his glowing screen. I want to try out for the elite traveling basketball team, and they need the tuition fully cleared before I can officially join the roster. Just sign the paper so I can get back to my game. I looked down at the ridiculous printed contract resting on the table and then glanced back up at my incredibly arrogant family completely ready to execute my ultimate sweet revenge. The incredibly quiet room felt completely suffocating as I stared down at the crisp white paper resting on the small coffee table. Richard had typed out a formal commitment contract demanding $25,000 of my hard-earned money for Tyler and his private school tuition. The sheer audacity of the document was absolutely breathtaking. I could feel my pulse pounding heavily in my ears. Every single instinct inside my body was screaming at me to stand up, flip the table, and scream the absolute truth right into their incredibly smug faces. I wanted to violently tear the contract into tiny pieces and throw it at Jamal. I wanted to loudly declare that I was the actual leaseholder of their massive estate, and that Richard was a financial failure. I wanted to expose Jamal and his cryptocurrency fraud right there in that cramped townhouse living room. But I took a slow, shallow breath and deliberately pushed all of that fiery anger deep down into my stomach. A massive, explosive confrontation right now would feel incredibly good for about 5 minutes, but it would ultimately ruin my carefully constructed plan. If I exploded today, they would simply play the victims. They would frantically call my property manager to beg for mercy, or desperately manipulate the banking situation before the legal eviction notice hit their front door. I needed them to remain entirely comfortable. I needed them to feel completely victorious and totally secure in their false reality. So instead of fighting back, I decided to play the ultimate psychological game. I decided to give them exactly what they desperately wanted to see: absolute, total submission. I slumped my shoulders forward, intentionally making myself look physically smaller and entirely defeated. I let my head drop, breaking my intense eye contact with Richard. I took a long, shaky breath, making sure it sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. I understand, I said, my voice barely above a soft whisper. The immediate shift in the room was truly incredible to witness. It was like a thick, dark cloud had suddenly lifted from the townhouse. Richard relaxed his rigid posture, leaning back against the beige fabric sofa with a deeply satisfied sigh. Susan loosened her tight grip on her designer handbag, a triumphant, nasty little smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Jamal uncrossed his arms and took another arrogant sip of his expensive whiskey, nodding his head in profound approval. Even Tyler stopped tapping his mobile phone screen to look up at me with absolute pure smugness. They completely bought my performance without a single ounce of hesitation. They genuinely believed they had successfully crushed my independent spirit and firmly forced me back into my designated pathetic role at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. "You are making the right choice, Dani," Richard said, his voice shifting from severe anger to a fake paternal warmth. "We are not trying to punish you simply for the sake of punishment. We just want you to be a productive member of this family unit. It is time for you to truly step up and carry your fair share of the financial weight." Susan reached across the distance and patted my knee, a gesture that made my skin crawl. "We know you have been lonely in your downtown apartment," she added, her tone dripping with toxic fake sympathy. "Sometimes living a selfish, isolated life makes people act out in strange, aggressive ways. But once you start contributing to Tyler and his bright future, you will feel a much deeper sense of purpose. You will finally feel like you belong with us again." Brittany scoffed lightly from the hallway, but her face was relaxed now. "Just make sure the guest bedroom is totally empty by Sunday," she reminded me. "Tyler really needs that extra space to set up his virtual reality gaming equipment. I do not want to see any of your old work suits hanging in the closet when I come over to help him decorate." I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the wooden floor, hiding the dangerous, icy smile that was desperately trying to form on my face. "I will clear out all of my personal belongings this weekend," I promised softly. "And I will absolutely take care of the tuition contract." I reached out and slowly picked up the crisp white paper, folding it neatly and placing it carefully into my leather work bag. "However, I do not have my checkbook with me right now," I lied smoothly. "I left it sitting on the kitchen counter at my apartment in my rush to get over here for this mandatory meeting." I looked up directly at Jamal, making sure my expression was perfectly compliant. But I know we are all gathering at the main house on Friday evening for your massive birthday celebration, I said, keeping my voice respectful. I will bring my checkbook to the birthday party on Friday night. I will publicly sign the tuition contract and write the $25,000 check right there in front of the family and all of your important investors. Consider it my grand apology for my unacceptable behavior this morning. Jamal grinned broadly, his massive ego stroked by my deliberate mention of his important investors and my promise of a grand public apology. That is incredibly mature of you, Dani, he said, pointing his whiskey glass at me. That is exactly the kind of cooperative energy I expect to see in my presence. You bring that check on Friday night, and we will wipe the slate completely clean. We will not even mention the declined credit card incident ever again. Richard nodded in agreement, clapping his hands together once. Excellent, he declared loudly. The matter is officially settled. You are dismissed, Dani. We will see you on Friday evening at the main house. Do not be late and make sure you dress appropriately for a luxury celebration. We do not want you looking like a corporate drone in front of Jamal and his wealthy friends. I stood up from the hard wooden chair and smoothed my skirt. I walked silently toward the front door, picking up my coat from the hallway table. I did not look back at any of them. As I stepped outside into the cool air and walked toward my car, I finally allowed myself to smile. It was a massive, wicked, exhilarating smile. They were so blinded by their own extreme arrogance and toxic greed that they could not see the legal trap closing tightly around them. They were happily gloating in their cheap townhouse, unaware that the luxurious estate they planned to party in was about to be legally ripped away. They demanded $25,000 from me, without knowing I had already cut off their monthly housing payment and drained their stolen emergency fund. Friday night was not going to be a celebration of Jamal and his fake wealth. Friday night was going to be an absolute legal slaughterhouse. The ticking clock was growing loud now. They had exactly 6 days left to enjoy their completely fake empire before I burned it entirely to the ground. The morning after the mandatory family meeting, I woke up with an incredible sense of absolute clarity. The heavy weight of their ridiculous ultimatum had completely vanished, leaving behind a sharp, focused determination deeply rooted in my mind. I was no longer the emotional punching bag for Richard and his fake empire of lies and endless deceit. I was a professional data scientist executing a perfectly calculated operation to protect my own future. I brewed a cup of black coffee and stood by my apartment window watching the busy city streets below. My family thought they had successfully backed me into a corner and forced me into total submission forever, without any form of resistance. They were currently planning a massive luxury birthday party for Jamal, completely unaware that the very foundation of their wealthy facade was about to crumble. I finished my coffee, dressed in my sharpest corporate suit, and grabbed my leather briefcase from the table. I was not going to the office today. I took a personal day. My first stop was the corporate office of the property management firm that oversaw the massive estate my parents currently occupied. The receptionist guided me to the office of Mr. Henderson, the senior property manager. He was a stern, older gentleman who respected punctuality and flawless financial records. I sat down across from his large mahogany desk and opened my briefcase. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," I said firmly, keeping my voice perfectly professional. "I am here to finalize the lease termination documents I submitted electronically this past weekend." He adjusted his glasses and pulled up my file on his computer monitor. "Yes, Dani, I received your notice looking slightly concerned. Your payment history has been absolutely flawless for 5 straight years. Are you entirely certain you want to break the lease and initiate an immediate eviction protocol for the current occupants?" I nodded firmly. "I am absolutely certain," I replied. "The current occupants are my extended family members, and I am officially withdrawing all financial support effective immediately. They do not have the financial capacity to assume the monthly rent of $7,800. Mr. Henderson sighed, sliding a stack of legal documents across the desk. "I understand," he said. "Since you are the sole guarantor, and you are voluntarily terminating the agreement, we must issue a formal 72-hour notice to vacate the premises. Because they are technically classified as your authorized guests who have overstayed their welcome, the legal process is actually much faster than a standard tenant eviction. I picked up his heavy pen and signed my name on the dotted line officially authorizing the immediate removal of my family from the property. With the property management paperwork officially secured, my next crucial step was coordinating the physical delivery of the notice. Because my father Richard and my brother-in-law Jamal were highly arrogant and prone to dramatic outbursts, I knew a simple letter taped to the door would not be sufficient. I needed an undeniable display of legal authority. I drove to the local county sheriff precinct and requested a brief meeting with the civil division deputy. Deputy Miller was a tall, imposing man. I sat in his small office and carefully explained the volatile dynamics of my family. I am formally evicting my parents and my sister from a luxury property I lease, I explained, keeping my tone completely objective. They have a history of extreme entitlement and unpredictable aggression. My brother-in-law Jamal is currently under the delusion that he is a wealthy investor, and my father firmly believes he owns the estate. They are hosting a massive luxury birthday party this Friday evening, and I need the official eviction notice served directly to them during that specific event. Deputy Miller raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You want us to serve a 72-hour eviction notice in the middle of a crowded birthday party? He asked, crossing his arms. I slowly nodded. Yes, I replied calmly. It is the only way to ensure they cannot secretly hide the document and pretend it never happened. I need the legal reality to be completely unavoidable, and I need to ensure my own physical safety when the truth is finally revealed. If you arrive exactly at 7 o'clock on Friday evening, the entire family and all of their guests will be gathered in the main foyer. Deputy Miller studied my face for a long moment before finally nodding in agreement. We handle civil standbys and official notices all the time, he said, typing the details into his dispatch system. We will have 2 uniformed deputies arrive at the property at exactly 7 o'clock this Friday. They will post the notice on the primary entrance and hand the official copies directly to the occupants. I thanked Deputy Miller, shook his hand, and walked out of the precinct. The legal mechanism was officially locked into place. Nothing could stop the impending collision now. I drove back to my downtown apartment and immediately began the final phase of my operation: the absolute lockdown of my personal assets. I opened my laptop and contacted my primary banking institution. I placed a hard security freeze on my social security number and locked down my credit report to ensure Richard could not attempt to open any fraudulent credit cards in my name once his own cash flow completely dried up. I changed every single password for my financial portals, my email accounts, and my cloud storage drives using complex randomized security keys. I was building an impenetrable digital fortress around my hard-earned life. Once my digital assets were completely secure, I turned my attention to the physical evidence. I connected my laptop to my high-quality laser printer and began printing the raw data files I had analyzed earlier this week. The printer hummed quietly. I printed the official Chapter 7 bankruptcy court documents, proving Richard was a complete financial failure. I printed the 5-year history of the joint emergency bank account, highlighting the exact dates and times they had stolen my money. And finally, I printed the massive lists of fraudulent wire transfers, proving Jamal was funneling my paycheck into his failing cryptocurrency wallets. I gathered the warm stacks of paper and carefully sorted them into 3 sleek black presentation folders. One folder was for Richard and his fake empire. One folder was for Jamal and his arrogant lies. And the final folder was for my own personal records. I placed the 3 black folders neatly into my leather briefcase and snapped the locks shut. The physical weight of the briefcase felt incredibly satisfying in my hands. It was the heavy weight of absolute, undeniable justice. I walked back into my living room and looked at the calendar hanging on my wall. It was only Tuesday afternoon. My family was currently out shopping for expensive party decorations and bragging to their friends about their upcoming luxury celebration. They were happily living out the final precious hours of their completely fake reality. I sat down on my velvet sofa and smiled into the quiet room. I was completely ready for Friday night now. Friday evening arrived with a crisp autumn breeze that perfectly matched the cold anticipation settling deep inside my chest. I pulled my reliable sedan onto the sweeping circular driveway of the massive luxury estate that my corporate salary had completely funded for the past 5 years. The sheer scale of the financial delusion on display tonight was absolutely staggering to witness. My parents had somehow secured a professional valet service to park the expensive leased vehicles of Jamal and his pretentious friends. A massive glowing white tent was set up on the perfectly manicured back lawn, complete with a live jazz quartet playing softly in the cool night air. Professional caterers in crisp white uniforms circulated smoothly through the growing crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with premium champagne flutes and expensive gourmet appetizers. Richard and Susan had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate their fraudulent son-in-law entirely on my dime. I parked my car near the very edge of the property and walked up the stone steps. I gripped my black leather briefcase tightly in my hand. It contained the absolute destruction of their false reality. I stepped through the grand double doors into the marble foyer and let the overwhelming noise of the lavish celebration completely wash over me. The house was packed with guests wearing custom-tailored suits and loudly exchanging hollow financial advice. Jamal was standing directly in the center of the massive sunken living room, holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon and loudly holding court. He was telling a highly exaggerated story about a massive digital currency trade he supposedly executed last month. His wealthy friends were nodding in deep admiration, completely unaware that the confident man speaking to them was secretly funneling stolen emergency grocery funds just to pay for his leased sports car. Brittany was standing proudly by his side, wearing a stunning designer silk dress, undoubtedly purchased using another secret loan drained from my bankrupt father. I stood quietly near the entrance, observing the spectacular theater of their fake lives. It was truly a masterpiece of modern psychological manipulation. My mother Susan spotted me from across the room and immediately pushed her way through the crowded living room. She was wearing a heavy diamond necklace that Richard had likely purchased long before his massive financial collapse 5 years ago. "Dani, you finally made it," Susan said, her voice artificially loud so the nearby guests could hear her enthusiastic greeting. She looked me up and down, visibly disappointed by my standard professional corporate attire. "I see you decided not to dress up for the occasion," she noted with a heavy, judgmental sigh. "Richard is entertaining some very important local politicians in the garden right now. Did you remember to bring your checkbook tonight like you promised us?" Susan asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We want to finalize Tyler and his private school tuition contract before we gather everyone to cut the birthday cake." I looked into her expectant eyes and offered a calm, obedient smile. "Yes, I remembered the checkbook," I replied smoothly, tapping the side of my heavy leather briefcase. "I have absolutely everything that you requested right here." "Excellent," Susan beamed, looking incredibly smug and victorious. "Go get a drink and mingle with the wives. Try to act naturally and please do not embarrass us tonight." Susan hurried away, leaving me alone near the edge of the crowded room. I walked toward the open kitchen island to pour myself a simple glass of iced water. Before I could even reach the crystal pitcher, my teenage brother Tyler deliberately shoved past me. He was flanked by 3 of his arrogant teenage friends from his expensive private school. They were all holding tall glasses filled with dark, sticky cherry soda. Tyler stopped right in front of me and smirked broadly. His eyes were full of the exact same toxic entitlement that infected my entire family. "Oh, look, guys, it is my boring sister Dani Tyler," announced loudly to his obnoxious friends. "She is the one who threw a massive crying tantrum over a simple pair of basketball sneakers last weekend." Tyler continued, his voice dripping with pure teenage arrogance. His friends laughed cruelly, looking at me with absolute blatant disrespect. Tyler took a deliberate step closer, his expensive new athletic shoes squeaking loudly on the highly polished hardwood floor. I guess you are here to pay for my tuition like a good little servant, he mocked, staring directly into my eyes. Without breaking our intense eye contact, Tyler deliberately tilted his tall glass slightly to the side. The dark, sticky cherry soda poured directly onto the floor, splashing aggressively against the tips of my clean leather work shoes. Oops, my hand slipped, Tyler said, offering a highly exaggerated fake gasp of surprise. His friends erupted into a loud chorus of obnoxious laughter. You should probably go find a kitchen towel and clean that mess up, Dani, Tyler ordered, pointing a commanding finger at the growing brown puddle spreading rapidly across the pristine floor. You would not want to ruin Dad and his expensive hardwood floors. Clean it up right now before someone slips and ruins the entire party. 5 days ago, this blatant act of aggressive disrespect would have completely broken my heart. 5 days ago, I would have felt absolute humiliation burning deep in my chest. But tonight I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculating anticipation. I did not yell at him. I did not run to find a kitchen towel. I simply took one calm step back, away from the sticky puddle, and looked directly at the antique grandfather clock standing tall in the corner of the grand foyer. It was exactly 6:55 in the evening. I had exactly 5 minutes. I looked back at Tyler and his smug friends. I will not clean that up, I said dangerously even. Do not worry about the floors. You will not have to look at them much longer. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the grand foyer ticked softly beneath the loud noise of the lavish birthday party. It was 6:55 in the evening. I stood perfectly still near the massive marble kitchen island, watching the spectacular display of pure arrogance unfolding all around me. My teenage brother Tyler had just deliberately poured sticky cherry soda directly onto my leather shoes, but I refused to give him the satisfying reaction he desperately wanted. I simply turned my attention back to the crowded room. The heavy wooden front doors were closed tightly, but I knew exactly what was coming. The local county sheriff and the senior property manager were currently driving toward this exact location carrying the legal documents that would permanently destroy my family and their fake empire. I just needed to survive the next 5 minutes without exposing my brilliant plan. Suddenly, a loud, sharp clinking sound completely silenced the massive room. My father Richard was standing directly in the center of the sunken living room, firmly tapping a silver spoon against the side of his crystal champagne flute. The live jazz quartet immediately stopped playing their instruments. The professional caterers froze in their places, holding their silver trays perfectly still. Dozens of wealthy guests wearing custom-tailored suits slowly turned their attention toward my father. Richard stood tall and proud, adjusting the lapels of his dark navy jacket. He looked like the ultimate successful patriarch, completely in his element. He had absolutely no idea that he was a bankrupt failure standing inside a rental property, funded entirely by the daughter he was about to humiliate. Thank you everyone for joining us this beautiful evening. Richard began, his deep voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings. Tonight we are gathered in my beautiful home to celebrate a very special young man. He turned and pointed his crystal glass directly at my brother-in-law Jamal. Jamal smiled arrogantly, wrapping one arm tightly around my sister Brittany. Richard continued his grandiose speech, pouring thick, toxic praise over the man who was secretly stealing my money. When Jamal first joined our family, I knew he was destined for absolute greatness, Richard declared proudly. He possesses the brilliant financial mind of a true modern visionary. He has brought immense pride to our family name. This massive estate and this wonderful celebration are a testament to the incredible legacy we are building together. The wealthy guests clapped politely, nodding in deep agreement. Jamal raised his glass, soaking up the fake admiration. My mother Susan wiped a fake tear from her eye, looking incredibly smug. I stood silently near the kitchen island, keeping my face perfectly neutral. The monumental irony of his speech was almost physically painful to endure. Richard was publicly bragging about his beautiful home when he literally did not own a single brick of the foundation. He was loudly praising Jamal and his financial brilliance when Jamal was actively draining Richard and his stolen grocery funds just to lease a sports car. Every single word echoing through the grand living room was a pathetic lie. But Richard was not finished speaking. The grand birthday toast was merely the opening act for his real performance. The entire speech was a carefully calculated setup designed to trap me publicly. Richard slowly lowered his crystal glass and turned his sharp eyes directly toward me. The crowd of wealthy guests naturally followed his gaze, parting slightly to create a clear line of sight between my father and me. I suddenly felt dozens of curious eyes staring at my standard corporate suit and my stained leather shoes. As the patriarch of this family, I believe in absolute loyalty and mutual support. Richard continued, his tone shifting from joyful celebration to strict paternal authority. We are incredibly blessed to have immense wealth, but wealth comes with a profound responsibility to care for our own bloodline. He slowly walked across the living room and approached the massive marble kitchen island where I was standing. My mother Susan eagerly followed close behind him, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her stomach. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and dramatically pulled out a crisp white piece of paper. It was the formal commitment contract he had forced upon me at the hostile family meeting. Richard placed the white paper directly onto the smooth marble surface of the kitchen island. He smoothed out the edges with his hands, making sure the bold printed text was clearly visible to anyone standing nearby. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold pen. He placed the gold pen deliberately on top of the contract and slid the paper slowly across the marble island until it stopped exactly 1 inch away from my hands. "We have a family tradition of investing in our future," Richard announced, his voice booming loudly for the entire party to hear. "My youngest son Tyler has recently been accepted into an elite athletic program at his private academy. The annual tuition is $25,000. As a family, we have collectively decided that my eldest daughter Dani will have the profound honor of completely funding this educational endeavor. It is a wonderful opportunity for her to finally contribute to the family legacy and share the massive financial burdens that Jamal and I carry every single day." A low murmur of polite approval rippled through the crowd of wealthy guests. They thought they were witnessing a beautiful moment of familial generosity. They had absolutely no idea they were participating in a brutal psychological trap. Richard had deliberately orchestrated this public spectacle to force my hand. He assumed that by cornering me in front of Jamal and his important investors, I would be too deeply embarrassed to refuse. He fully expected me to quietly pick up the pen, sign the ridiculous contract, and hand over $25,000 just to avoid causing a massive dramatic scene. Susan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the marble island. "Go ahead, Dani," she urged, her voice dripping with fake maternal encouragement. "Sign the paper and show everyone here that you truly support your brother." Tyler smirked from across the room, holding his empty soda glass. Jamal crossed his arms, staring at me with a dark, commanding expression. The pressure in the room was incredibly heavy. The silence stretched on for several long, agonizing seconds as everyone waited for me to submit to their toxic demands. I looked down at the crisp white paper and the heavy, solid gold pen. I did not reach for the pen today. I did not speak or move away. I simply stood there, breathing slowly. I looked directly into Richard and his expectant eyes. His confident smile slowly began to falter, just a tiny fraction. I slowly turned my head and looked past Richard toward the antique grandfather clock standing proudly in the corner. It was exactly 6:59 in the evening. I had exactly 1 minute left until my entire family lost absolutely everything they claimed to own. The doorbell was about to ring very loudly. I am entirely ready for this. The heavy silence in the grand living room felt completely suffocating as dozens of wealthy guests watched me standing near the massive marble kitchen island. The solid gold pen rested perfectly still on top of the crisp white tuition contract. I could feel my father Richard staring intensely at my hands, fully expecting me to surrender to his toxic public pressure. My mother Susan leaned closer, her expensive perfume filling my senses with a sickeningly sweet aroma. Every single person in the room genuinely believed that I was entirely trapped by the heavy weight of our supposed family legacy today. Jamal stood near the center of the crowd, crossing his arms over his custom-tailored jacket, with an expression of pure, arrogant victory. My teenage brother Tyler smirked openly, holding his empty glass of cherry soda, completely ready to celebrate my massive financial defeat. The atmosphere was incredibly thick with their shared entitlement and their absolute greed. They had spent 5 long years aggressively demanding my financial support while simultaneously treating me like a pathetic burden. I slowly raised my right hand, letting my fingers hover carefully, just a few inches above the heavy gold pen and the white paper. Richard smiled broadly, assuming I was finally submitting to his ultimate patriarchal authority. He took a deep, confident breath, preparing to deliver another highly arrogant speech to his wealthy guests. But right before my fingertips could even brush against the cold metal of the gold pen, a sharp, piercing sound suddenly shattered the tense silence. It was the loud, demanding chime of the front doorbell ringing throughout the grand foyer. The unexpected noise echoed aggressively off the vaulted ceilings, entirely breaking the heavy psychological spell Richard had so carefully cast over the lavish living room. My timing was truly flawless. The entire party immediately froze in place. The wealthy guests exchanged highly confused glances, wondering who could possibly be arriving so incredibly late to the private celebration. Richard frowned deeply, his perfect public facade slipping for a brief second as his grand performance was rudely interrupted. He quickly recovered his composure, adjusting his tailored jacket with a smooth, practiced motion. "Excuse me for just a moment, everyone," Richard announced loudly, projecting his voice to sound perfectly calm and entirely in control. "It seems we have a late arrival joining our wonderful family celebration tonight. Please continue to enjoy the champagne." Richard confidently turned his back on me and walked slowly toward the heavy double doors of the grand entrance. The valet worker standing near the doorway quickly pulled the massive wooden door open to reveal the unexpected visitors standing outside. Two tall, uniformed county sheriff deputies stepped firmly into the brightly lit foyer, their heavy utility belts rattling slightly in the quiet space. Directly behind them stood Mr. Henderson, the senior property manager, holding a thick black clipboard and a large rolled-up piece of bright orange paper. The stark visual contrast instantly sent a massive shockwave across the room. The presence of law enforcement at a private luxury event immediately caused the wealthy guests to step backward, creating a wide path. Richard stopped walking, his confident smile completely freezing on his face as his brain desperately tried to process the surreal situation. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project his usual patriarchal authority over the imposing officers standing inside his home. "Good evening, officers," Richard said, using his deepest, most commanding voice. "I am Richard, the owner of this estate. Is there some sort of minor noise complaint regarding our live music tonight that needs my immediate attention?" Deputy Miller did not respond to Richard. He did not shake his extended hand. In fact, the tall deputy completely ignored my father as if he were entirely invisible. The officer slowly scanned the crowded living room, his sharp eyes sweeping past the lavish decorations and the terrified guests. He was looking for one specific person. His gaze finally landed on me, standing perfectly calm near the massive marble kitchen island. Deputy Miller immediately walked straight past Richard, brushing shoulders with my stunned father, and marched directly across the living room, stopping right in front of me with absolute purpose. "Good evening, miss. Are you the primary leaseholder of this property?" The deputy asked, his voice loud and extremely clear. Every single person in the massive room gasped in collective shock at his highly specific question. I picked up the heavy gold pen that Richard had placed on the counter. But instead of signing the ridiculous tuition contract, I turned to the senior property manager who had followed the deputy. Mr. Henderson handed me his thick black clipboard containing the official lease termination forms. "Yes, officer," I replied confidently. "I am the sole leaseholder of this entire rental property today." I smoothly signed my full name on the required legal forms, using my father and his expensive gold pen. Mr. Henderson nodded in quiet appreciation, taking the clipboard back from my hands. "Thank you for your swift cooperation," he stated politely. "As requested, your lease is officially terminated, effective immediately. We will now proceed with the formal notification process for the unauthorized occupants currently residing here." Richard stood frozen in the center of the living room, his mouth hanging wide open in sheer disbelief. Susan clutched her expensive handbag so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white under the bright lights. Mr. Henderson turned away from me and slowly unrolled the massive piece of bright orange paper he was holding. He walked purposefully toward the grand double doors of the entrance. Everyone watched in absolute stunned silence as he pulled a roll of thick tape from his jacket pocket. With deliberate and highly visible movements, the property manager slapped the bright orange document directly onto the center of the heavy wooden door. The bold black letters on the paper were massive, making the devastating legal message completely unavoidable for anyone standing inside the room. It was a formal eviction notice document. Deputy Miller stepped forward to officially address the terrified occupants. "By order of the Property Management Company, you are hereby served with a mandatory 72-hour notice to vacate these premises," he announced loudly, reading from his official notepad. "Because the primary leaseholder has withdrawn all financial support and terminated her legal residency, you have exactly 3 days to remove all personal belongings and permanently vacate this entire estate. Failure to comply with this order will result in immediate physical removal and potential criminal trespassing charges." The massive party completely ground to a dead and highly shocked halt, forever. Jamal lowered his expensive bourbon glass, spilling dark amber liquid all over his designer shoes. Brittany covered her open mouth with both hands, letting out a quiet, dramatic gasp of total horror. Tyler literally dropped his sticky cherry soda onto the floor, ruining his precious new sneakers entirely. The wealthy guests began loudly whispering among themselves, pointing at the massive orange sticker on the door and staring directly at Richard. I calmly placed the heavy gold pen back down onto the marble island, leaving the ridiculous tuition contract completely blank. The ultimate destruction of their fake empire had officially begun. The bright orange paper stuck to the heavy wooden door seemed to glow violently under the expensive crystal chandelier hanging in the grand foyer today. The 72-hour eviction notice was specifically designed by the county to be highly aggressive and completely impossible for anyone to ignore. The sheer shock of the moment held the entire luxury birthday party captive in a state of absolute paralysis. The wealthy guests who had just been loudly clapping for Jamal and his supposed financial brilliance were now completely frozen in place. They were staring wide-eyed at the armed county sheriff deputies standing inside the house. Richard stood perfectly still for 3 long, agonizing seconds as his brain desperately misfired. He was trying to process a legal reality that completely contradicted his carefully constructed delusions of immense wealth and power. The natural color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking incredibly pale and suddenly very old under the bright party lights. But Richard had spent the last 5 years surviving entirely on his massive ego and his unique ability to boldly lie his way out of highly uncomfortable situations. His initial shock quickly morphed into deep, aggressive indignation. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his tailored navy jacket, and took 3 heavy, confident steps toward Deputy Miller. His expensive leather shoes clicked loudly against the polished marble floor, completely breaking the heavy silence of the room. "What kind of absolutely ridiculous prank is this?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing with a forced, artificial authority. He pointed a violently shaking finger at the bright orange paper defacing his beautiful front door. "I demand that you remove that absurd sticker immediately and leave my private property right now. I am a highly respected businessman in this community, and I own this massive estate. There has obviously been some massive clerical error at the county office, and I will be calling the chief of police in the morning to personally report this terrible harassment. You are ruining a very expensive private celebration for my family." Deputy Miller did not flinch or take a single step back. He was completely immune to the arrogant bluster of wealthy men throwing angry public tantrums. The tall officer simply rested his hand near his heavy utility belt and looked directly at Richard with an expression of pure professional boredom. "There is absolutely no clerical error, sir," the deputy replied, his voice steady and incredibly firm. "This property is owned by a corporate management firm, and the legal leaseholder has officially terminated the rental agreement today. You are currently classified under the law as an unauthorized occupant. You have exactly 3 days to pack your personal belongings and completely vacate the premises. If you are still inside this house when the deadline officially expires on Monday evening, my deputies will return to physically remove you and your family." Mr. Henderson, the senior property manager, stepped out from behind the armed deputies and nodded in strong agreement, holding his thick black clipboard tightly against his chest. "I processed the legal termination paperwork myself. Less than 2 hours ago," Mr. Henderson added calmly, keeping his eyes fixed on my father. "The residential lease is definitively cancelled, and the owner wants the property completely empty by next week." Richard looked wildly back and forth between the armed deputy and the stern property manager. The confident, wealthy patriarch persona was rapidly crumbling, leaving behind a panicked, desperate man. He spun around to face the crowded living room, desperately trying to salvage his precious reputation in front of his important local investors and wealthy friends. "This is just a massive misunderstanding." Richard laughed loudly, a horrible, nervous sound that completely lacked any real joy or confidence. "It is just a minor banking glitch, folks. Please continue drinking your champagne and enjoying the live jazz music while I quickly sort out this tiny administrative headache with the authorities." Richard then turned his frantic, angry eyes directly toward me. I was still standing perfectly still, near the massive marble kitchen island, watching his spectacular public downfall with absolute emotional detachment. "Dani," Richard snapped, his voice sharp and full of toxic desperation, "call the bank right now and fix whatever stupid mistake you made with the emergency accounts. Tell this property manager that the rent check cleared today. Do it right now before I completely lose my temper and kick you out of this family forever." The entire room slowly shifted their collective attention back to me. Jamal was staring at me with a deep, heavy scowl, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, completely forgetting his fake wealthy persona. My mother, Susan, was practically hyperventilating, clutching her diamond necklace and whispering frantically to Brittany, who looked like she was about to faint. Tyler was hiding near the kitchen counter, looking absolutely terrified, holding his ruined sneakers. The wealthy guests watched me with immense curiosity, waiting to see how the quiet corporate daughter would fix this massive, humiliating disaster for her incredibly wealthy father. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs completely. I did not pull out my mobile phone. I did not rush to follow his aggressive orders like I had done so many times before. I calmly picked up the heavy gold pen that was still resting on the marble island and slipped it casually into my suit pocket. Then I took 3 deliberate steps forward, stepping completely out of the shadows and directly into the bright center of the grand living room. I looked at the terrified, wealthy guests, then at the confused property manager, and finally I locked my eyes directly onto my father. "I am not calling the bank, Richard," I said, my voice incredibly calm but carrying perfectly across the silent room. "There is no minor clerical error, and there is absolutely no banking glitch to fix tonight." Richard stared at me, his face contorting into a mask of pure, absolute rage. "What are you talking about, you ungrateful brat?" he hissed, taking a threatening step toward me. "Tell them we own this house. Tell them to leave our property immediately before I call my lawyers." I stood my ground, completely unafraid of his empty threats. The imposing presence of the armed sheriff deputies in the foyer gave me absolute physical security, allowing me to finally unleash the devastating truth I had carefully hidden for half a decade. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the lethal blow. "You do not own anything," Richard, I said, speaking slowly and articulating every single word with icy precision. "You do not own this beautiful estate. You do not own the expensive cars parked in the driveway. And you certainly do not possess any real wealth. I do. I am the sole legal leaseholder of this entire property. I have paid $7,800 every single month for the last 5 years, just to keep a luxury roof over your head, because you secretly went entirely bankrupt and begged me to save you from living on the street. I paused, letting the massive weight of those specific numbers crash into the silent room. The wealthy guest gasped loudly instantly, stepping further away from Richard as if his financial failure was a highly contagious disease. I canceled the lease tonight, I continued, my voice rising just enough to completely dominate the space. I permanently cut off your secret emergency funds. You have exactly 3 days to get out of my house. The absolute truth hung heavily in the air, completely destroying 5 years of toxic manipulation in a single spectacular moment. Richard stumbled backward violently, as if my sharp words had physically struck his chest. He grabbed the edge of the smooth marble kitchen island, desperately trying to keep his balance, while his entire fraudulent world shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. Susan began sobbing loudly, burying her face in her hands. The nightmare was finally over today. The heavy silence that followed my massive revelation was suddenly shattered by a loud, piercing scream. My older sister Brittany lunged forward from the center of the crowded living room. Her face was flushed with intense anger and absolute panic. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You are a massive liar, Dani," she screamed, her voice echoing harshly against the vaulted ceilings today. "You are just incredibly jealous of Jamal and his massive success. Dad owns this beautiful house, and you are making up these absolutely ridiculous stories to ruin the most important night of our lives." Brittany spun around to face the wealthy guests, desperately trying to repair the rapidly collapsing illusion. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Brittany pleaded, waving her hands frantically. "My sister has always been deeply unstable and bitterly envious of our wonderful family. She works a boring corporate job and simply cannot handle the incredible wealth my father and my husband have accumulated." Richard quickly nodded, stepping forward to join his daughter in her desperate defense. "Yes, exactly," Richard agreed loudly, his voice shaking slightly. "Dani is completely delusional, and we will have her escorted out right now." I did not argue with their frantic, pathetic lies. I did not raise my voice to defend my professional reputation or my personal sanity. I simply allowed them to dig their own social graves a little bit deeper. I reached down and picked up my heavy black leather briefcase from the polished floor. I placed it gently onto the smooth surface of the massive marble kitchen island. The sharp metallic click of the brass locks opening sounded incredibly loud in the tense room. Everyone watched in absolute frozen silence as I slowly opened the lid of my sleek briefcase today. I reached inside and pulled out the first black presentation folder. It was incredibly thick, filled with undeniable factual evidence gathered by a professional data scientist. I looked directly into Richard and his terrified eyes as I slowly opened the dark cover. Inside was the complete documented history of his monumental financial failure. These were not simply printed emails or casual bank statements. These were official certified legal documents from the federal court system. It was the absolute undeniable proof that Richard was a complete financial fraud who had secretly lost everything he owned exactly 5 long years ago today. I pulled the crisp white documents from the dark folder and held them up for a brief moment. Then I deliberately dropped the thick stack of papers directly onto the center of the marble island. They landed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sliding slightly across the polished stone surface. "Here is the absolute truth," I announced, my voice perfectly clear and completely unwavering. "These are the official Chapter 7 bankruptcy court records filed by Richard 5 years ago. They detail every single massive debt, every foreclosed property, and his absolute total financial ruin for everyone here to clearly read today." The wealthy country club friends and the important local politicians could not resist their own intense human curiosity. Several of the most prominent guests slowly stepped closer to the marble island, leaning forward to look at the scattered legal documents. The bold federal court stamps and Richard and his official signature were completely impossible to deny. A collective gasp of pure horror rippled through the gathered crowd as the absolute reality of the situation finally registered in their shocked minds. The man they had been admiring and listening to all evening was nothing more than a pathetic, broke imposter today. I watched Richard closely as the grand illusion of the wealthy patriarch instantly and permanently shattered. The physical transformation was truly astonishing to witness. His broad, confident shoulders completely collapsed inward, as if a massive invisible weight had suddenly crushed his spine. His expensive, tailored navy jacket suddenly looked entirely ridiculous hanging loosely on a defeated old man. His skin turned a sickly pale gray color, completely devoid of any life or arrogant energy. He stared down at his own bankruptcy papers with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for clean air today. My mother Susan reacted with equal devastation. The wealthy matriarch persona she had so aggressively maintained completely dissolved in a matter of seconds. She dropped her designer handbag onto the hardwood floor, spilling expensive cosmetics and loose coins everywhere. She covered her face with both of her trembling hands, letting out a long, high-pitched wail of absolute social agony. She knew perfectly well that in their highly exclusive social circles, losing your money was a minor tragedy, but aggressively lying about it to your wealthy friends was an absolute unforgivable crime. Her precious reputation was officially dead forever today. The heavy silence in the grand living room was quickly replaced by a rising tide of angry, panicked whispers. The wealthy guests were completely scandalized. I heard the word fraud whispered repeatedly among the crowd. A prominent local politician shook his head in deep disgust, completely turning his back on Richard. A wealthy real estate developer, who had been laughing with Jamal just 10 minutes earlier, set his crystal champagne flute down on a side table with a loud, angry clatter. The intoxicating atmosphere of the lavish luxury celebration had completely mutated into a scene of intense social toxicity today. Nobody wanted to be associated with a public financial scandal or a highly humiliating police eviction. The guests began moving swiftly toward the grand double doors, completely ignoring Richard and his desperate silent pleas for them to stay. They grabbed their expensive coats and hurried out into the cool evening air, eager to escape the massive sinking ship. In less than 2 minutes, the massive living room was practically empty, leaving only my completely destroyed family standing among the expensive catered appetizers. But my ultimate revenge was not quite finished yet, because Jamal still needed to face his consequences tonight. The grand living room was rapidly emptying as the wealthy guests fled from the massive financial scandal. The polished marble floors echoed with the sounds of hurried footsteps and hushed whispers of absolute disgust. My father Richard was completely paralyzed, leaning heavily against the kitchen island while his entire fake empire burned to the ground. My mother Susan was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. But my brother-in-law Jamal was not ready to surrender just yet. Jamal had built his entire public identity around being a fearless alpha male and a highly successful modern cryptocurrency investor right here today. He could not afford to let his remaining business partners and his arrogant friends see him standing passively, while a quiet corporate data scientist completely destroyed his family. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his custom-tailored jacket, and took several heavy steps toward me. His dark eyes were burning with intense anger and toxic masculinity. He stopped just inches from my face, deliberately, using his tall, physical presence to intimidate me. "Listen to me very carefully," Dani Jamal hissed, his deep voice vibrating with absolute malice. "You might have managed to embarrass Richard tonight with your ridiculous paperwork documents, but you are not going to disrespect me in front of my important investors right now." Jamal turned his head slightly, making sure his wealthy friends who had lingered near the doorway were closely listening to his bold words. "I am a self-made millionaire," Jamal declared loudly, projecting his deep voice across the grand foyer today. "I pull in $50,000 on a slow weekend trading digital assets. Do you honestly think I care about this rented house or your petty little lease agreement? I can easily buy a massive estate for Brittany tomorrow in cash without sweating. You are just a bitter, lonely woman throwing a massive public tantrum because you are completely jealous of my incredible financial success. He pointed a heavy finger directly at my chest. Pack up your cheap little briefcase and get out of my sight before I call my high-powered attorneys to sue you for public defamation. Jamal crossed his arms over his chest, offering me a cruel, highly confident smirk. He genuinely believed his aggressive alpha male routine would immediately force me to retreat. He expected me to lower my eyes, apologize for causing a scene, and quietly run away. He thought his loud, arrogant words could simply overwrite the absolute, undeniable truth I had just exposed. I did not back away from his pointing finger. I did not flinch or break our intense eye contact. I stood perfectly still, feeling an overwhelming wave of cold calculation wash over my entire body. Jamal had just given me the perfect opening to completely destroy his pathetic fake life. I offered him a slow, highly dangerous smile that instantly wiped the arrogant smirk right off his face. "You are absolutely right, Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady now. "You do not care about this rented house because you never contributed a single penny to maintain it. But you do care very deeply about my money." I slowly turned away from him and reached back into my heavy leather briefcase sitting on the smooth marble island. I pulled out the second thick black presentation folder. This folder was significantly heavier than the first one. It contained dozens of pages of highly detailed financial spreadsheets, bank statements, and digital routing numbers. I slapped the heavy black folder directly onto the marble surface, right next to Richard and his bankruptcy files. Documents from before were still resting there completely undisturbed. I opened the dark cover, revealing the massive stack of pristine white papers, completely filled with undeniable financial data. "I am a professional data scientist, Jamal," I announced clearly, making sure every single person remaining in the room could hear my words perfectly. "I analyze massive data sets to uncover hidden patterns and expose massive financial fraud for a living. And your personal financial data tells a truly fascinating story today." I pulled the top sheet of paper from the folder and held it up for his so-called investors today. They clearly saw the truth. 5 years ago, I opened a joint emergency bank account for my parents to buy basic groceries and survive their massive bankruptcy. Every single month, I faithfully deposited $2,000 of my hard-earned corporate salary into that account. I looked directly at my sister Brittany, who was standing nearby trembling with intense anxiety. "But my money was never used to buy food, Brittany," I stated firmly. "Every single month within 3 days of my deposit clearing, your father Richard secretly initiated a direct wire transfer. He drained my emergency funds and sent everything. Money flowed to a third-party digital wallet." I dropped the paper back onto the marble counter and pulled out a second document featuring bright highlighted rows of numbers. I traced those specific routing numbers and digital wallet identifiers. I continued, my voice echoing loudly in the silent room. Every single wire transfer was routed directly into a failing cryptocurrency exchange account registered under your fake holding company, Jamal. You are not a self-made millionaire. You are not a financial genius pulling in $50,000 a weekend. You are an absolute broke fraud. You have been secretly stealing cash. $120,000 of my hard-earned money through my bankrupt father to cover your terrible crypto debts and lease your fancy sports car. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. The remaining wealthy investors stared at Jamal with pure absolute disgust. A man who steals grocery money from his bankrupt father-in-law to fund a fake luxury lifestyle is the lowest form of pathetic scum in the financial world. The investors shook their heads in deep contempt and immediately walked out the front door, completely abandoning Jamal and his fake empire forever. Brittany cried. She unleashed a horrifying loud scream of pure betrayal. She lunged forward, grabbing Jamal by his custom-tailored jacket. "You told me we were rich!" she shrieked hysterically, hitting his chest with her fists. You told me you bought my car with cash. Jamal stumbled backward, his dark eyes wide with panic as his entire world completely collapsed. I stood there calmly watching the chaotic scene unfold before me. Tyler was sitting on the floor crying loudly as he finally realized his expensive private school days were officially over. Richard was still gasping for air, gripping the marble counter today. He looked like a drowning man holding onto a tiny piece of driftwood. Jamal tried to push Brittany away, but she continued to scream and slap his chest, demanding answers about their massive hidden debts. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out the original voice message transcript he had sent me just a few days ago. The transcript perfectly captured his toxic arrogance and his ridiculous demands for a gold watch. I placed the transcript gently on top of the massive pile of financial evidence and snapped my empty briefcase completely shut. You played dangerously, Jamal. The heavy silence in the grand living room finally shattered completely. For a few seconds after my massive revelation, nobody moved or breathed. Then the reality of the stolen $120,000 fully crashed into Brittany. The pristine silk designer dress she was wearing suddenly felt like a heavy costume made of pure lies. She let out a guttural sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a raw mixture of total heartbreak and absolute violent rage. Brittany lunged directly across the polished marble floor toward Jamal. She did not ask him for a quiet explanation or wait for him to smoothly lie his way out of the disaster. She grabbed the lapels of his custom-tailored jacket with both of her shaking hands and began shoving him violently backward. "You completely lied to me!" Brittany screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with intense emotion. "You told me you were a millionaire. You told me our entire life was paid for by your massive investments. You made me look down on my own sister while you were secretly stealing her money to buy my car." Jamal tried to grab her wrists and push her away, but he was now completely overwhelmed by her sheer physical panic. He stumbled backward against a heavy wooden side table, knocking over a crystal vase. It shattered loudly against the floor, sending sharp pieces of glass flying everywhere. Jamal raised his hands defensively, trying to salvage whatever tiny scrap of dignity he had left. "Brittany, please calm down," he begged, his deep, confident voice completely replaced by a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "The crypto market just took a temporary downward turn. I was going to pay Richard back as soon as the altcoins recovered. You have to believe me." But Brittany was completely beyond listening to reason today. She slapped his chest hard, her diamond rings catching the bright light of the chandelier. "You are a broke fraud," she shrieked hysterically, hitting him again and again. "You have completely ruined my life." Watching my older sister physically assault her fake millionaire husband was truly a spectacular display of karmic justice. But the absolute chaos was only just beginning in that massive rented house. My father, Richard, finally snapped out of his paralyzed state of shock. He had spent the last 5 years blindly worshipping Jamal as the ultimate financial savior of our family. Now he realized that Jamal was the exact reason his secret bankruptcy was completely exposed to his wealthy friends and the local politicians. Richard pushed himself away from the marble kitchen island, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He marched aggressively toward the struggling couple, pointing a trembling finger directly at Jamal. "Get your hands off my daughter, you pathetic thief!" Richard roared, stepping directly into the chaotic mess of broken glass. "I trusted you with my family. I trusted you with our emergency survival funds. You looked me right in the eye and promised me those digital investments were guaranteed to double our money in 6 months." Jamal shoved Brittany away hard enough to make her stumble and turned his frantic attention to Richard. "You gave me that money willingly." "Richard," Jamal yelled back, his fake wealthy persona entirely abandoned for desperate self-preservation. "You were just as incredibly greedy as I was. You wanted to get rich quick without doing any actual work. Do not stand there and act like a purely innocent victim. You handed over Dani and her hard-earned cash because you were too much of a pathetic coward to admit you were completely broke. The pure, unadulterated hypocrisy of two massive financial frauds loudly accusing each other of stealing was absolutely beautiful to witness. Richard lunged forward, grabbing Jamal by the collar of his ruined jacket. "I am going to have you arrested for massive wire fraud," Richard screamed, spraying spit directly into Jamal in his face. "I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a federal prison." While the two men loudly threatened each other with legal action and physical violence, my mother Susan was completely losing her mind on the opposite side of the room. She was sitting directly on the polished hardwood floor, surrounded by the spilled contents of her designer handbag, weeping uncontrollably. Her precious social reputation was officially dead, and she knew she could never show her face at the elite country club ever again. But the most satisfying reaction belonged entirely to my teenage brother Tyler. He was pressed tightly against the far wall of the living room, clutching his ruined basketball sneakers against his chest. His eyes were wide with pure, absolute terror. The reality of his new situation was finally sinking into his highly entitled teenage brain. There would be no elite virtual reality gaming room for him to use this weekend. There would be no incredibly expensive private school tuition paid on Friday. There would be no more luxury vacations or designer clothes funded by my corporate salary. He began taking short, shallow breaths, his chest heaving rapidly as a massive panic attack completely took over his body. Mom Tyler gasped loudly, dropping his sticky shoes onto the floor. "Mom, I cannot breathe. What is going to happen to us? Where are we going to live next week?" Susan could not even look at him. She just rocked back and forth on the floor, completely broken. Tyler looked over at me, his previous toxic arrogance entirely replaced by desperate fear. "Dani, please," he begged, his voice trembling with genuine panic. "Please do not cancel the lease. I am sorry I pushed you down. I am sorry I ruined your shoes. Please, just fix this." I looked at the golden child who had violently shoved me to the floor just 5 days ago. The boy who had demanded I clean up his deliberate mess less than an hour ago. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him today. I looked away from my completely broken family and calmly picked up my empty black leather briefcase from the smooth marble kitchen island. I snapped the brass lock securely shut. The loud metallic clicking sound cut sharply through the heavy sounds of weeping and angry yelling. I casually adjusted the collar of my corporate suit and slowly picked up my purse. I walked deliberately toward the grand double doors, stepping very carefully around the massive puddle of sticky cherry soda and the sharp shards of broken crystal glass. Richard and Jamal were still violently arguing near the beautiful stone fireplace, completely consumed by their own toxic rage. I paused right by the front door, standing directly under the bright orange eviction notice that marked the absolute end of their reign. "Thank you all for the absolutely wonderful entertainment tonight," I announced loudly, offering them one final icy smile. "Enjoy your remaining 3 days in my house." I turned around, pushed the heavy wooden doors open, and walked out into the cool, quiet night, forever, ready to start my brand new successful life completely alone today. The weekend passed with a heavy, suffocating silence, and before my family even knew what hit them, Monday morning finally arrived in all of its brutal reality. The 72-hour legal eviction window had completely slammed shut today. I parked my reliable sedan down the street from the massive luxury estate simply to observe the absolute finality of my grand decision. The bright orange eviction sticker was still plastered aggressively to the heavy wooden front door, completely visible to the entire affluent neighborhood. But the most striking visual of the morning was the massive rented moving truck parked directly in the center of the sweeping circular driveway. The bright orange and white logo of the cheap rental company completely clashed with the pristine manicured lawns and the elegant stone architecture of the beautiful property. It was a brutal visual reality check that perfectly signaled the absolute end of their fraudulent empire forever. There were no professional movers in crisp uniforms carefully wrapping expensive furniture today. Because I had completely severed their access to my corporate salary and drained the stolen emergency bank accounts, they simply could not afford to hire any professional help. My father, Richard, who had confidently strutted around that exact same driveway just 3 days ago wearing a custom-tailored navy jacket, was now sweating profusely in a stained white shirt, trying to shove a heavy dresser up the steep metal ramp today, completely alone outside. My mother, Susan, was not faring any better in this incredibly harsh new reality today. The wealthy country club matriarch persona she had so desperately tried to maintain was entirely gone forever. She was frantically rushing in and out of the grand double doors carrying cheap cardboard boxes filled with designer clothes and expensive kitchen appliances they did not actually own. Her hair was completely disheveled, and her expensive makeup was visibly smeared across her face. Every single time a luxury car slowly drove past the house, Susan would panic uncontrollably. She would immediately drop whatever heavy box she was carrying and aggressively turn her back toward the street, desperately trying to hide her face from the wealthy neighbors she had spent 5 years trying to deeply impress. The absolute sheer public humiliation of being legally evicted in broad daylight was completely destroying her entirely. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind today. The massive house of cards had completely collapsed, leaving them totally exposed to the harsh judgment of the real world. Richard loudly cursed as the heavy wooden dresser slipped from his hands and crashed violently against the metal ramp, completely scratching the expensive polished wood. He stood there gasping for clean air, looking completely defeated and entirely broken by the massive weight of his own terrible choices, while Susan loudly sobbed near the pristine garden, entirely consumed by her absolute massive social ruin right now today. The absolute worst part of their entire situation was the total lack of available financial resources today. Over the long weekend, the authorities had moved incredibly fast regarding my brother-in-law Jamal and his massive fraudulent activities. Because I had formally provided the county sheriff and federal investigators with highly detailed financial spreadsheets and undeniable proof of his digital wire fraud, Jamal was now the central target of a massive criminal investigation. The authorities immediately froze every single bank account associated with his fake holding company and his personal digital wallets. Unfortunately for Richard, his own financial accounts were heavily intertwined with Jamal and his massive fraudulent enterprise. When the federal investigators locked down Jamal, they also completely froze Richard and his remaining banking access, pending a full comprehensive legal review. My parents had absolutely zero access to any liquid cash today. They could not swipe a credit card. They could not write a personal check. They could not even withdraw $20 from an automated machine. Because their credit scores were completely ruined from the original bankruptcy 5 years ago, they absolutely could not qualify to sign a new residential lease anywhere in the city. Their fake wealth was entirely gone, and their real poverty was incredibly severe and completely permanent. They were entirely trapped by the brilliant legal snare I had perfectly constructed for them, leaving them absolutely defenseless and completely devastated right now, here today, forever. This massive financial disaster hit my teenage brother Tyler harder than anyone else in the entire family today. Just 3 days ago, he was an arrogant, highly entitled rich kid who violently shoved me onto the dining room floor and deliberately poured sticky cherry soda all over my leather work shoes. He had proudly demanded that I pay $25,000 for his elite private school tuition so he could play on the prestigious traveling basketball team. But as I watched him slowly walk out of the house, carrying 2 stuffed garbage bags full of his precious expensive sneakers, the reality of his new life was clearly visible on his tear-stained face. He was crying loudly, wiping his red eyes with the sleeve of his designer sweatshirt. Because the massive tuition check never arrived, the elite private academy had officially pulled his enrollment first thing Monday morning. He was no longer a student at the prestigious school. He would not be playing on the elite traveling basketball team this season. He was going to be transferred immediately to the local public high school in the middle of the academic semester. The wealthy friends who had cruelly laughed at me during the birthday party had already completely blocked his phone number and abandoned him entirely. Tyler finally understood that his entire social identity was completely tied to my stolen money today, and he was absolutely ruined forever right now. I sat quietly in my car watching the pathetic scene slowly unfold until the moving truck was finally packed to the very brim. Richard slammed the heavy metal door of the truck completely shut and locked it with a heavy sigh of absolute defeat. They had nowhere luxurious to go today. Because they had absolutely no credit and completely frozen bank accounts, Brittany could not even take them in. Her townhouse was currently a massive chaotic war zone as she desperately tried to navigate the legal fallout of Jamal and his incoming criminal charges. With absolutely no other viable options available, Richard and Susan were forced to drive that massive rented truck to a cheap, cramped roadside motel situated on the very edge of the city limits. It was a rundown building with flickering neon signs and incredibly thin walls. They were going to have to cram their remaining designer clothes and their massive inflated egos into a single tiny motel room with 2 cheap beds and a tiny television. As Richard slowly drove the moving truck out of the circular driveway and merged onto the main road, I felt a profound sense of absolute closure wash over me today. The luxury estate was completely empty now. The toxic financial parasites had been permanently removed from my life forever. I put my reliable sedan into drive and slowly pulled away, heading absolutely home, completely entirely free today, right now, forever. 2 months have passed since the chaotic night that completely changed my life forever. The autumn chill has settled into the city, bringing a crisp, refreshing breeze that flows through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown luxury condominium. Unlike the massive rented estate my family occupied, my home is completely paid off. It is a stunning modern penthouse overlooking the beautiful city skyline, filled with plush furniture and vibrant green plants. For 5 long years I lived in this beautiful sanctuary completely alone, and my family never bothered to visit me a single time. They were too busy pretending to be incredibly wealthy in a house they did not own to care about the daughter who was actually paying for their extravagant lifestyle. Now my days begin with quiet mornings, hot coffee, and absolute financial freedom. The heavy burden of supporting their toxic delusions is entirely gone, and my bank accounts are rapidly growing. I have officially reclaimed my entire life, my personal happiness, and my absolute freedom today, moving forward into a very bright and wonderful future completely entirely on my own terms. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the secure intercom system in my kitchen suddenly buzzed loudly. I walked over and pressed the silver button, listening to the polite voice of my building concierge downstairs. He informed me that a frantic older woman was standing in the lobby, demanding to see me immediately. She claimed it was a massive family emergency. I knew exactly who it was. I authorized the concierge to send her up to my floor, taking a deep breath to prepare myself for the inevitable confrontation. 2 minutes later, a timid knock echoed against my heavy oak front door. I slowly opened it, revealing my mother Susan standing in the carpeted hallway. The visual transformation was absolutely shocking to witness. The wealthy, arrogant country club matriarch was completely gone. Susan looked at least 10 years older. Her expensive highlights had faded to a dull gray, and she was wearing a simple, faded sweater. She looked completely exhausted and entirely broken by her new reality. "Dani, please," she whispered, her voice trembling with intense desperation. "Please let me come inside and talk to you." I did not step aside to let her into my beautiful sanctuary. I stood firmly in the doorway, crossing my arms over my chest. "Say whatever you need to say right here, Susan," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. Susan immediately burst into heavy sobbing, burying her face in her hands. She began to rapidly pour out a chaotic story of absolute misery. She told me that Jamal was currently facing serious federal wire fraud charges and Brittany had filed for a messy divorce. Richard was completely depressed, refusing to leave their cramped, cheap motel room because he was too ashamed to face the real world. And Tyler was absolutely miserable at the local public high school, constantly complaining about the terrible cafeteria food and the lack of wealthy friends. "We have absolutely nothing left, Dani," Susan cried, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. "We are going to be kicked out of the cheap motel next week because Richard cannot find a job and we have zero money saved. I know we treated you terribly. I know we took advantage of your incredible generosity, but we are your family. You have this massive, beautiful condo and so much money. Please, Dani, just give us enough cash to rent a small apartment. I promise things will be entirely different this time. We will respect you. We will appreciate everything you do. Just please do not let your own mother become homeless today." I stood perfectly still, watching her tears fall onto the carpeted floor. A few years ago, her desperate crying would have completely broken my heart. I would have instantly reached for my checkbook, terrified of losing her maternal love. But standing here today, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, deep sense of finality. I looked at the woman who had happily watched her golden son physically shove me to the floor. The woman who had demanded I buy a $10,000 watch for the boy who abused me. The woman who had enabled massive financial fraud just to keep up her ridiculous wealthy appearances. I looked directly into her desperate eyes and offered a slow, cold smile. "You made your choices, Susan," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper. "You chose to fund a fraud. You chose to protect an abuser. And you chose to treat me like a pathetic walking bank account for 5 long years. I am not your financial savior anymore." I took a step back into my beautiful, quiet apartment and placed my hand firmly on the edge of the heavy oak door. And as for Tyler, I added, staring right through her, "Tell Tyler to enjoy eating on the floor." I slammed the heavy oak door completely shut in her face, engaging the solid metal deadbolt with a loud and incredibly satisfying click that echoed throughout the quiet, empty hallway. I did not look through the peephole. I simply turned around and walked back into my sunlit living room, letting out a long, peaceful breath. Cutting toxic ties is incredibly painful at first, but it ultimately fuels a level of deep inner peace that cannot be bought with any amount of money. I finally chose myself today, and I have never been happier. Have you ever had to completely walk away from toxic family members who only valued you for your financial contributions? Tell me your personal survival stories in the comments section below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that true peace comes from setting absolute iron boundaries against emotional and financial abuse today. Thank you so much for watching my journey, listening to my story, and continually supporting my channel every single day. The story we just shared is a powerful testament to the absolute necessity of establishing strict boundaries with family members who view you solely as a financial resource, rather than a human being deserving of respect. Growing up in a toxic environment often conditions us to believe that our personal value is entirely dependent on our endless usefulness to others. We are taught to sacrifice our own stability to uphold the fake appearances and reckless choices of our parents or siblings. However, the profound lesson here is that unconditional love should never require continuous financial transactions or the sacrifice of your own mental health. Financial abuse within families is incredibly insidious because it is frequently masked as family loyalty or moral obligation. But draining your bank accounts to fund someone else and their deliberate delusions is not an act of love, it is an act of self-destruction. True independence begins the exact moment you realize that sharing DNA does not obligate you to tolerate constant disrespect, manipulation, or financial exploitation. You absolutely have the fundamental right to protect your peace, your hard-earned career, and your personal sanctuary. Reclaiming your power requires you to stop waiting for apologies that will never come and start taking definitive action to protect your future. Walking away from toxic relatives does not make you a cold or selfish person. It simply makes you a strong survivor who refuses to be emotionally blackmailed any longer. Take a moment right now to deeply evaluate the relationships in your own life. Are you currently carrying a heavy burden that does not belong to you today? If this profound lesson deeply resonated with your personal journey, please share this important video with someone who desperately needs the necessary courage to loudly say, "Enough is enough today."